You've heard the legend. The grandson of Genghis Khan ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen. But here's the truth. Nobody tells you. Kublai Khan did not die on a battlefield, sword in hand. Imagine this. The man who once commanded an armada larger than D-Day, who dined in golden halls that dazzled Marco Polo, ended his days too obese to walk, convinced his empire was slipping through his fingers. And he was right. Within decades, everything he built collapsed in rebellion and shame. This is not a victory story. It's a descent, 6 levels of humiliation and horror. From storms the Japanese called divine winds, to court conspiracies that made Game of Thrones look tame, to a deathbed so foul it became legend. Forget the myth of the invincible Mongol emperor. Tonight we dig into the grotesque downfall of Kublai Khan and why even the mightiest conqueror cannot escape sickness, sorrow, and the slow humiliation of time. He was supposed to be nothing more than the shadow of his grandfather, Genghis Khan, the man who had ridden out of the steppes like a storm, crushing civilizations beneath the hooves of Mongol horses, left behind a legend so terrifying that even whispering his name could make cities surrender. And yet his grandson Kublai dared to dream even bigger, not just to conquer, but to rule, not just to burn, but to build. To some, he was the Mongol who became more Chinese than the Chinese themselves. To others, he was a traitor to his ancestors, trading the saddle for a throne. Kublai Khan was born in 1215, in a world already scarred by Mongol conquest. The empire stretched like a scar across Eurasia, from the Pacific Ocean to the fringes of Europe. But raw brutality could only get you so far. Armies could level cities, but they couldn't feed them. They could terrify peasants, but not persuade them to hand over their harvest willingly. Kublai seemed to understand something his grandfather never cared about, that ruling an empire meant more than breaking it. It meant learning how to hold it together. Unlike his Mongol peers, who boasted about their scars and reveled in slaughter, Kublai studied. He surrounded himself with Chinese scholars, Persian administrators, Buddhist monks. He read their books, absorbed their philosophies, and most shocking of all, he respected them. Imagine a Viking suddenly quoting Aristotle or a warlord binge-reading Confucius. That was Kublai, a conqueror who wanted to be seen as a civilized emperor. And for a moment it worked. In 1260, after bloody struggles for succession, Kublai seized the title of Great Khan. By 1271, he declared a new dynasty, the Yuan, and set up his capital not in the dusty steppes of Mongolia, but in a city of stone and silk, Khan Balik, modern-day Beijing. For the first time in history, China bowed to a foreign ruler, and the Mongols weren't just marauders, they were emperors. His capital stunned visitors. Grand avenues wider than anything in Europe, markets that seemed to overflow with treasures from every corner of Asia, and palaces so immense that Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler, swore no king in Europe could match the Khan's wealth. It was a world where silk and silver crossed paths with gunpowder and exotic spices. Under Kublai, the Silk Road didn't just survive, it thrived, humming like the internet of the 13th century, connecting east and west in ways unseen since Rome. But beneath the splendor, shadows lingered. Kublai's empire was dazzling on the surface, yet it was stitched together with fragile threads. The Mongols were conquerors, not administrators. Every province came with its own customs, its own resentments, its own ticking time bombs. The Chinese farmers resented the barbarian foreigners, who demanded higher taxes than their native dynasties ever had. The Muslim administrators who ran his finances clashed with Buddhist monks who despised their greed. Even within his own family, rival claimants whispered against him. Their loyalties stretched thin across a vast empire. Kublai believed he could hold it all together with vision, with power, with sheer will. But history has a cruel way of testing the ambitions of men who think they are larger than life. His grandfather had carved an empire with fire and blood, but Kublai wanted to cement it with grandeur, and grandeur demands money, armies, resources, each one a weight tied around the neck of his empire. The glittering capital might have dazzled Marco Polo, but to the farmers breaking their backs in the fields, it was nothing but proof of a ruler who grew fat while they starved. For now, the world saw a golden emperor at the height of his power, but gold can tarnish. Beneath the silk and marble, cracks were already spreading. The Mongol Empire was too vast, too diverse, too restless to remain whole. Kublai had made himself master of China, lord of half the world. But the bigger the empire, the harder the fall. It should have been unstoppable. Imagine an armada so massive, it dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. 4,000 ships, more than 140,000 men. Bigger than the D-Day landings, 6 centuries before D-Day ever existed. A war machine forged not just to conquer a nation, but to erase it from the map. This was Kublai Khan's dream in 1281, to bring Japan, that stubborn island of samurai, to its knees. But history had other plans. The first attempt had already been a humiliation. In 1274, Kublai sent a fleet bristling with soldiers and weapons across the stormy seas. It was meant to be a swift blow, Mongol cavalry crushing samurai foot soldiers. Instead, the seas turned violent. Typhoons ripped through his ships like paper toys. The survivors, battered and broken, limped home. For a man who believed himself favored by heaven, this was a wound to his pride. But Kublai Khan did not retreat. He doubled down. 7 years later, he assembled something unprecedented, an invasion force so large it strained the resources of his empire. Chinese shipwrights worked themselves to exhaustion. Farmers watched their harvests seized to feed an army that was never coming back. The cost was staggering, but Kublai believed sheer scale would bend the gods themselves. When his fleet set out, it seemed the ocean had turned black with sails. No island could resist. No army could stand. And then came the winds. A typhoon, unlike anything they had ever seen, descended on the Mongol fleet. Waves the size of mountains hurled ships into each other, snapping masts like twigs. Soldiers in heavy armor sank like stones. Tens of thousands drowned, their bodies washing up on Japanese beaches for days afterward. Whole divisions vanished overnight, swallowed by the sea. The Japanese watched from the shore, stunned, convinced that divine powers had intervened. They named the storm Kamikaze, the divine wind. It was more than a meteorological event. It was a cultural earthquake. The Mongols, who had stormed across continents and crushed empires, had been beaten not by warriors, not by fortresses, but by the sky itself. Nature had become Japan's shield. For the samurai, it was proof of heavenly protection. For Kublai, it was humiliation carved into the memory of the world. The sheer absurdity still shocks today. Imagine the Pentagon building the largest fleet in human history, only to have it all wiped out in a single hurricane before even firing a shot. That's what happened to Kublai Khan, the most powerful man alive, undone by weather. But this was not simply a story of bad luck. The storm revealed the cracks already widening in his empire. The resources poured into this doomed armada had drained his treasury. The conscripts taken from China and Korea never came home, leaving behind villages without fathers and sons. Farmers whispered that the barbarian emperor was bleeding them dry for his own glory. Even among the Mongols, many began to question whether their great Khan had lost heaven's favor. After all, how could a ruler chosen by the gods lose to the wind? The defeat scarred Kublai's reputation. Marco Polo would later describe his dazzling palaces, his golden halls, his endless feasts. But behind those glittering images lurked the memory of the drowned. The divine winds had shown the world that even the Mongols could be stopped, and stopped in the most humiliating way imaginable. Kublai, however, refused to see it as the end. He still believed he could conquer, that fortune would bend to his will. But history had already turned against him. The oceans had swallowed his armies. His treasury was bleeding, his people were restless, and his enemies were watching closely. The greatest conqueror of his age had tried to claim Japan and lost everything to the sky. But instead of retreating into humility, Kublai Khan's hunger only grew darker. And he wasn't finished wasting lives and treasure. Every conqueror has his battlefield. For Kublai Khan, it wasn't a clash of armies that broke him. It was the silence left behind when one voice disappeared. In 1281, as his empire strained under the weight of endless campaigns, Kublai suffered a loss no victory could erase. His wife, Empress Chabi, was gone, and with her the man who had once bent continents to his will began to crumble. Chabi was not just a consort draped in silk. She was his partner, his counselor, his anchor in the storm of politics and war. She tempered his fury, softened his brutality, and gave his rule something rare, legitimacy. Even the Chinese, who despised their Mongol overlords, respected Chabi for her compassion. She had advised against reckless wars, urged mercy for civilians, and even influenced religious tolerance at court. Without her, Kublai might never have managed to sit the dragon throne. Her death left a wound too deep for empire or glory to fill. The great Khan, the man who had hurled fleets across oceans, sank into a pit of grief. The once disciplined ruler began to indulge every weakness. He drank heavily, not the measured toasts of diplomacy, but endless goblets that blurred nights into days. Food, women, and opulence became his escape. Banquets grew grotesque in their excess, a haze of roasted meats, flowing wine, and hollow laughter echoing in halls that once brimmed with strategy. It was as though he tried to drown his sorrow in consumption, feasting as if Chabi's absence could be filled with gluttony. But grief is not so easily fooled. The more he ate, the more he drank, the emptier he became. The warrior who once embodied Mongol toughness now seemed fragile, swollen, and distracted. To his generals, he was no longer the sharp-eyed strategist who had once ridden with them into battle. He was a man haunted, dragging the corpse of his sorrow behind him like a ghost, chained to his throne. This collapse was more than personal. It was political suicide. In a world where Mongol rulers were judged by their strength, Kublai's weakness was a weapon handed to his enemies. Ministers began whispering that the great Khan had lost his edge. Foreign embassies saw a ruler drunk and indulgent, not fearsome and disciplined. Even his soldiers felt betrayed. Their emperor, who once shared their hardships, now sat surrounded by dancers and cups of wine while they bled on distant frontiers. It is tempting to pity him, a man crushed by love lost, human like the rest of us. But pity quickly gives way to dread, because this grief warped into something darker. Without Chabi's steadying influence, Kublai's temper ran unchecked. He grew paranoid, suspicious, volatile. The court turned into a dangerous theater, where a poorly chosen word could mean exile or execution. Advisors who once dared to speak honestly now wrapped every truth in honey, terrified that the grieving emperor might lash out. And outside the palace, the cracks widened. The farmers who fed his empire saw their taxes rise even higher to pay for Kublai's failed wars and indulgent court. Resentment smoldered in the countryside, rebellion flickered in the shadows. Chabi had once urged him to keep the people in mind. Without her, he barely seemed to notice them. The death of one woman might not seem enough to topple an empire, but in this case, it was the first domino. The center of Kublai's world was gone, and nothing, not silk, not gold, not armies, could steady him again. His grief was not a fade, it was a disease, one that spread from his heart to his throne, from his private sorrow to the empire itself. And grief was only the beginning. He had once been the living image of Mongol power, a rider who could thunder across the steppe for days, a conqueror who ate hardship for breakfast. But by the late 1280s, the body of Kublai Khan had turned against him. The man who ruled the world could no longer even rule his own flesh. His decline was grotesque. Contemporary records describe him as so swollen with fat that he waddled like a caricature of himself. His attendants struggled to lift him from his bed. Where once he mounted horses, now he could barely shuffle from one end of a hall to another. The empire that had been built on speed and endurance was led by a man who couldn't walk without groaning in pain. Gout gnawed at his joints, making every step feel like knives stabbing into his feet. His legs swelled until they resembled pillars of flesh, raw and useless. Physicians tried everything: herbal poultices, massages, prayers, but nothing eased the torment. In modern terms, we'd recognize more than gout. Symptoms point to diabetes, infections that wouldn't heal, constant exhaustion, sudden swings of mood and energy. At times he suffered strokes that slurred his speech and left half his face drooping. The conqueror, who had once commanded armies with a booming voice, now rasped like a broken reed. His palaces, once vibrant with the energy of empire, began to reek. The air filled with smoke from burning herbs, the sour stench of medicine, and the fetid odor of a body rotting from the inside. Courtiers covered their noses with sleeves as they bowed, pretending loyalty while hiding their disgust. The mighty Khan Balik, the shining capital Marco Polo had described in glowing awe, now doubled as a sick room where every corridor whispered of decline. Soldiers heard the rumors. Their emperor was soft. The man who once charged with them into battle had become a glutton trapped behind silk curtains. To hardened Mongol generals who measured honor by scars and stamina, this was betrayal. They muttered that the Khan had forgotten the ways of their ancestors, trading the saddle for pillows, the hunt for banquets. Loyalty that had once bound the Mongol horde together began to fray, thread by thread. And those banquets, oh, the banquets. Even in agony, Kublai gorged himself. Tables bent under roasted meats, exotic fruits, rivers of wine. He ate as though feasting might fill the void left by Shabby's death, as though gluttony could numb his grief. But each indulgence only chained him tighter to his failing body. The warrior, who once galloped across Asia, could now barely shuffle to his table of endless feasts. The irony was unbearable. The conqueror of continents, conquered by his own appetite. His enemies laughed, but his allies despaired. Ministers who had once feared his sharp mind now saw him dulled by excess. Meetings dragged, decisions faltered, tempers flared. Where Kublai had once balanced Mongol ferocity with Chinese statecraft, now he seemed lost in fog. The empire was still vast, still rich, still terrifying on paper, but its master was slipping, and everyone knew it. This transformation wasn't just personal humiliation. It was political poison. In Mongol culture, strength wasn't symbolic. It was survival. A Khan who could not ride, could not fight, could not command with his presence, was barely a Khan at all. Kublai's decline whispered treason into the ears of rivals, inspired defiance in conquered peoples, and planted doubt in the hearts of his own soldiers. Weakness was contagious. His body had become a metaphor for the empire itself, bloated, diseased, and struggling to move forward. And yet Kublai refused to face reality. Surrounded by flatterers who praised his every slurred word, he sank deeper into denial. They laughed at his jokes, assured him his wisdom was unmatched, and fed his illusions with each course of meat and wine. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, rebellion brewed, famine spread, and the empire's arteries began to clog. It is one of history's cruelest ironies. The man who embodied Mongol conquest, whose armies had once seemed unstoppable, spent his final years imprisoned in his own failing body. His legs no longer carried him to war. His voice no longer carried authority. His once terrifying presence had become a sad spectacle, a warning of what awaited all rulers who mistook excess for immortality. But Kublai's tragedy was not only physical, because while his body collapsed in plain sight, something even more dangerous was unraveling just beyond the palace walls. It wasn't just his body failing, it was his empire. The empire outside his walls was starving. Inside, the tables broke under the weight of roasted meats, rare fruits, and rivers of wine. The contradiction was grotesque. Peasants clawed at barren soil, while their emperor swallowed banquets so excessive they could have fed entire villages. It wasn't just a ruler out of touch, it was an empire rotting from the top down. Kublai Khan had always been extravagant, but in his final years, his indulgence turned obscene. Every feast was a performance, courtiers lining up to praise his appetite as if gluttony itself were a form of statecraft. They told him the empire was flourishing, even as famine hollowed the countryside. They praised his wisdom, even as the treasury bled silver into failed wars and empty palaces. It was a theater of lies, and the emperor was both the star and the fool. Meanwhile, China groaned beneath the weight of his empire. Endless wars. Japan, Vietnam, Java had drained the coffers and cost countless lives. To pay for his fantasies, Kublai raised taxes again and again. Hunger breeds anger, and anger breeds rebellion. Across the countryside, peasant uprisings flared like sparks in dry grass. Secret societies whispered that the Mongols had lost heaven's blessing. In China, this was no idle rumor. It was the ultimate indictment. The mandate of heaven was the divine right to rule. And when disasters struck, famine, floods, plagues, it was a sign the gods had turned their faces away. To peasants watching their children starve while the emperor grew obese, the message was obvious. The Yuan dynasty was cursed. The irony was unbearable. Kublai wanted to be remembered as the great civilizer, the foreign emperor who brought prosperity to China. Instead, he became the symbol of everything corrupt and alien. In his glowing palaces, he celebrated like a god, while outside the very people who built his empire whispered that heaven had abandoned him. He didn't lose the loyalty of soldiers or ministers first. He lost the loyalty of farmers, the foundation of Chinese dynasties for centuries, and once the foundation crumbles, the palace is already doomed. Imagine a modern CEO of a collapsing company, hosting champagne galas while his employees are laid off in droves. That's what Kublai's reign became. Excess at the top, misery at the bottom. But this wasn't corporate mismanagement. This was life and death. Every cup he raised to his lips was bought with the hunger of 1,000 peasants. Every song sung at his feasts echoed against the silence of villages where no children cried anymore because there were no children left alive. And yet, inside those walls, the charade continued. Courtiers flattered him, assuring him he still held heaven's favor, that rebellions were minor, that the empire was strong. No one dared tell the truth. In a palace drowning in food, honesty had starved to death long before the peasants did. The Mongol tradition prized toughness, rulers who could endure cold, hunger, the bite of the steppe winds. But Kublai's empire had become the opposite. Bloated, decadent, fragile. It looked mighty on the surface, but inside, the rot spread. He could feast all he wanted. He could drink until he forgot. But the empire outside was watching, judging and preparing to tear itself free from his grip. Because history has a brutal rhythm. When rulers grow weak, their people grow restless. And when rulers grow weak, their courts grow cruel. It began with whispers, not of rebellion in the provinces or famine in the fields. Those had been easy enough to ignore, but whispers in the marble corridors of his own palace. Kublai Khan, the great Khan, the emperor who had once seemed untouchable, was losing his grip. Some said grief had driven him mad, others swore it was the sickness rotting his body that had poisoned his mind. But all agreed on one thing: the palace had become a theater of terror. In the years after Shabi's death, the man who once relied on her calm counsel turned suspicious, volatile and cruel. Her voice had balanced his rage, softened his impulses. Without her, every shadow seemed dangerous, every advisor a traitor. The court, which had once hummed with debate, fell silent under the weight of his paranoia. Ministers who had served loyally for decades found themselves accused of treachery overnight. Generals who had led armies to victory were dismissed in disgrace or executed in secret. It was as though Kublai had turned his sword inward, hacking away at the very men who had built his empire. And what replaced them? Flatterers, liars, cowards who told him only what he wanted to hear. The court filled with sycophants who bowed low and praised his wisdom. Even as the empire collapsed around them, they laughed at his jokes. They applauded his indulgence. They reassured him he was still chosen by heaven. And Kublai, too broken to see through the charade, believed them. The more he doubted his real allies, the more he clung to the parasites. The atmosphere was suffocating. Every banquet, every meeting, every whispered conversation carried the risk of death. Servants moved silently, terrified their expressions might be misread. Ministers spent their days crafting careful sentences, words wrapped in layers of praise, never daring to speak plain truth. The wrong phrase could end in exile, or worse, fear, once the weapon Kublai used against the outside world, now devoured his own palace. His paranoia spread like rot. Rumors circulated that he had ordered secret purges of officials, that he had generals executed, not for failure but for popularity, that he trusted astrologers and mystics more than his own commanders. Whether or not every story was true hardly mattered. What mattered was that everyone believed them. To live in Kublai's court was to exist in permanent dread, never knowing when the emperor's grief-stricken fury might land on you. It's a story that feels almost modern, like a dictator spiraling in the final years of his regime. Surrounded by yes-men and terrified of his own people, Kublai's rule turned inward, and self-destructive power became paranoia. Loyalty became suspicion, and the empire he had once commanded like a machine of conquest became a nest of deceit, a palace where truth itself was an endangered species. What makes it more horrifying is the human cost. These weren't nameless ministers, they were men who had followed him for decades, who had bled for him on campaign, who had trusted his leadership, and now they died quietly, dismissed or silenced, not on the battlefield, but in the emperor's chamber of fear. Every execution weakened the empire, every dismissal frayed the chain of loyalty, and every whisper of madness deepened the cracks. The Mongols had always prided themselves on loyalty to their Khan, even when empires shifted, even when dynasties rose and fell. But loyalty has limits, and in Kublai's palace, the bond between ruler and servant had turned poisonous. He could not tell friend from foe, and in time, that blindness would prove fatal. The conqueror who had once terrified the world was now terrifying only his own people. His empire was already trembling, famine and rebellion gnawing at its edges. But the emperor himself had become something worse than weak. He had become dangerous to everyone closest to him. And then came the final humiliation. Winter can be merciless, but the winter of 1293 into 1294 was especially cruel, for it was the season when the body of Kublai Khan, once the terror of nations, finally betrayed him completely. The man who had commanded the greatest empire on earth now lay motionless in a bed he could no longer escape. His legs, once used to crush enemies beneath galloping hooves, were swollen and useless. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one sounding like a man drowning on land. There was no dignity left. Courtiers crept around his chamber, whispering in muted tones, terrified of both his wrath and his death. The stench of sickness hung thick in the air, an odor that no amount of incense could disguise. Physicians shuffled in and out like actors in a hopeless play. They tried everything: herbs ground into bitter pastes, bloodletting, chants, prayers. Nothing worked. Each day he sank further, his body deflating, his once bright eyes dull and sunken. This was not the glorious death of a conqueror. There was no clash of swords, no thunder of cavalry, no blaze of arrows in the sky. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, died the way many of us fear most, trapped in a body that refused to obey, surrounded not by loyal comrades, but by fearful servants who covered their noses against the smell of decay. And yet, no one dared speak the obvious truth. To admit that the great Khan was dying might cost them their lives. So they bowed, they smiled, they pretended that recovery was still possible. In the silence of the palace, a grotesque charade unfolded. Ministers delivered good news about rebellions supposedly crushed, crops supposedly thriving, silver supposedly flowing into the treasury. Everyone knew it was a lie. Everyone knew the empire was rotting, just as surely as the man in the bed. But lies were safer than honesty. On February 18th, 1294, the charade ended. Kublai Khan finally exhaled for the last time. He was 78 years old, ancient by the standards of his day, but far from immortal, and for a man who once dreamed of ruling all under heaven, his final moments were unbearably small. No enemy brought him down. No rival cut him down in battle. He was destroyed by sickness, grief, and excess. The emperor, who had sent fleets across oceans, could not even rise from his own bed. His death was humiliating in its physicality. Attendants struggled to move his massive body, straining under the weight. There was no noble image to preserve, only the sight of servants fumbling with the corpse of a ruler who had once commanded millions. For the Mongols, who prized toughness and glory above all, the end was an insult. Their greatest emperor had not died with honor on a battlefield, but rotted into weakness, a living reminder that even the mightiest can collapse into helplessness. It should have been the end of the story. A sick man dies, an empire mourns, but with Kublai, even death could not offer closure, because the Mongols had a tradition of burying their rulers in secret, in places no enemy could ever defile. His corpse began a journey shrouded in mystery and blood. His funeral procession was called the Dead Road, a path where no living creature was allowed to witness the passing of the great Khan. And so, even in death, Kublai Khan remained both feared and dangerous. His body left the palace in silence, guarded and hidden, destined for a grave that has never been found. Legends claim anyone unlucky enough to cross the procession's path, man, woman, or animal, was slaughtered to preserve secrecy. The Conqueror was gone, but the horror of his story was not. Because even in death, his story refused to end. The death of a conqueror is never simple. For the Mongols, it was never just about grief or ceremony. It was about power, secrecy, and fear. And so, when Kublai Khan finally succumbed in 1294, his body did not rest in peace. It embarked on one of the most chilling journeys in history, a journey the Mongols called the Dead Road. The rules of this road were brutal. No living creature was permitted to see it. Anyone unlucky enough to cross paths with the cortege, man, woman, or child, was slaughtered instantly. Even animals that wandered too close were cut down. Horses, dogs, oxen, nothing was spared. Silence and secrecy were worth more than life itself. The Mongols believed their great Khans must vanish into the earth without trace, hidden from enemies, grave robbers, or even memory. And so the funeral procession became a river of blood, a moving slaughterhouse that erased its own trail. Imagine it. Peasants tilling their fields, suddenly confronted by a wall of horsemen escorting a massive guarded bier. There was no escape. To witness the passing of the Khan's body was to sign your death warrant. The procession carved a path across the landscape, but it left no witnesses alive to tell its direction. The only testimony we have are the legends whispered afterward, legends soaked in terror, and the destination that remains a mystery to this day. Some believe Kublai was carried to the sacred slopes of Burkhan Khaldun, the same mountain said to conceal the grave of his grandfather, Genghis Khan. Others imagine vast underground chambers filled with treasures, gold, weapons, silks, and priceless artifacts entombed with him. A king's ransom sealed beneath the soil. Some stories claim rivers were diverted to bury him beneath their waters, nature itself becoming his tomb. But no grave has ever been found. Kublai Khan, like Genghis before him, vanished into legend, his body swallowed by secrecy. This secrecy was more than superstition. It was political theater. The Mongols wanted the world to believe their rulers were untouchable, even in death. No grave to desecrate, no corpse to display, just an eternal, invisible presence, lingering like a ghost across the steppe. Even enemies could not claim victory over a Khan's body. By hiding it, the Mongols turned their emperors into myths, larger in death than in life. But the cost of maintaining that myth was monstrous. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, may have died just to preserve the silence of a funeral. The dead road was less a funeral procession and more a moving execution line. A grim reminder that the empire's cruelty did not end with its ruler's last breath. In death as in life, Kublai Khan left a trail of bodies behind him. Centuries later, archaeologists still search for his tomb. Expeditions comb Mongolia and northern China, chasing rumors, scanning valleys, following scraps of legend. Each discovery of ancient bones or collapsed chambers sparks new speculation, but the grave itself remains hidden. Perhaps it always will. That was the point. The dead road was meant to erase him from the physical world and replace him with something more terrifying: mystery. And that mystery worked. Kublai's empire may have collapsed, his dynasty may have withered, but his legend endures because no one can point to the place where he lies. He is everywhere and nowhere, like a shadow that refuses to fade. But while the funeral cortege may have kept his secrets, it could not protect his legacy, because as Kublai's corpse disappeared into the earth, the cracks in his dynasty burst into the open. The Mongols could kill peasants, silence servants, and bury emperors in mystery. What they could not bury was rebellion. The dead road ended in secrecy, but the empire it left behind was out of time. Because his dynasty's fate was sealed,